Yo, what's good, people? This is probably one of my most requested videos. So yeah, I'm going to be breaking down on my mixing chain, how I typically go about mixing a lead vocal. Today's video we're going to be using just Logic stock plugins to do so. And yeah, I'll make this a two-part series. So in another series, I'll go through the plugins I'll actually use day to day. So my Waves UAD. So yeah, let's have a listen to what we're going to be mixing. So here's a preview Unmixed.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the question.
And here's a preview of the mixed version.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant. Before we do this, I'ma need to grab my grinder and crash some Cali with a little bit of Benson.
So this is a track that I started working on quite a few years ago. I've just stumbled across this. So yeah, I probably didn't actually finish the track. So as you can see, it's a 2-track. So I've bounced out the instrumental, and then there's just 1 track for the vocals. So no ad-libs, nothing. So just 1 straight vocal. Cool, so there's a few things you're going to want to check before you even get started. So first of all, like I said, I'm working to a 2-track. You want to first of all make sure that your project BPM matches the BPM of the track. So this track was made at 86 BPM. My project is at 86 BPM. Reason for this, when you start to add time-based effects like delays, they sync up to your project BPM. So you want to make sure your project BPM is correct. Also little things like if I wanted to just loop like a 4-bar section, right, you wouldn't be able to do that if you didn't have the correct BPM. So that's step number 1, just making sure that your project BPM matches the BPM of whatever it is that you are mixing. That being said, let's have a listen to the track without any effects.
Oh yeah. You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of...
Okay, right, so that is the track raw without any effects. So there's a few things to address here. Typically speaking, a lot of producers, when they post beats on YouTube or even to BeatStars, they have the beats already mastered, right? So the beat of the gate is already competing with commercial tracks. Now, we don't want to be mixing this loud, right? So our first step is going to be to reduce, I guess, the gain of the 2-track, just to give us some headroom, because later on down the line, we're going to master the full song anyways with the vocals. So I'm going to go ahead, so select my 2-track. I'm going to go on my region. Then I just want to bring down the gain. Now, how I like to do this, so I like to do this with the vocal playing. So essentially, I just want to make sure that I can hear my vocal nice and clear over the beat, right? So I'm going to give myself that room. So I'm going to play this, then turn the instrumental down gain-wise.
Oh yeah. You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle.
So now it sounds a lot neater. I can hear the vocals clearly over the beat. And what this also means is that I don't have to overwork my plugins and making things like my compressor do the heavy lifting just to get my vocals to sit on top of the mix. So yeah, step number 1 is just gain staging, make sure we leave some headroom in the instrumental. Cool, so the way that I like to mix, so typically speaking, this is a one-off where I've got just 1 vocal track. A lot of the times it's very common when you're recording especially to have your vocals split across different tracks, right? Now, rather than adding the effects directly onto each track, I like to group all of my vocal tracks and then I put all of my processing on that bus. and it's just gonna make it a lot easier for my computer to deal with. So to do that, even though I've only got one track, but just showing you this in case you've got multiple tracks, you select all of your tracks, and then if you go Shift, Command, and D, this pops up, and we want a summing stack. And what that does is it groups everything into a bus, right? So rather than adding effects directly onto the track, I'm gonna add my effects on the bus, which is gonna affect everything that's in the bus, right? Cool. So I'm gonna get rid of this too, because I've only got one vocal. And I'm gonna rename these vocal bus, right? Now on the main vocal, there's typically two things I like to add directly onto the channel, and then obviously I add the rest of my effects on the bus. So this particular vocal, as you can hear, the artist is singing, right? And for this style, I want to use some pitch correction. So we're going to use just the stock plugins. So not on the bus, on the track directly. I'm going to insert my pitch correction from Logic. Now to use pitch correction, you need to know what key your song is in. So I know, because I made this, that this song is in the key of G. So I need to set my pitch correction to G. I also need to set the scale, so I know it's G major. And essentially, it's gonna lock every note that's been sung to the G major scale. So very important that we get this right. Now the next thing that's gonna be important is this response time. So this is essentially how aggressive the auto-tune behaves. So 0 will give you a very robotic sort of sound, whereas moving this clockwise will give you a more natural sort of sound. So if I wanted that tip-in sort of effect, I'll be all the way here, and I'll back off a little bit if I wanted a more natural sound. So let's start off around here. Then as it's playing, I'm just gonna find the response time that I like.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question.
So yeah, I like that effect for this particular style. So yeah, quite aggressive on the pitch correction. But yeah, just stylistically, that's what I'm going for in this track. But yeah, remember I said the key is very important for your auto-tune. So watch what would happen if I add this here to a wrong key. So let's go F, for example.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can.
Right, so it's gonna sound horrible, so make sure you get your key right.
You're taking everything I'm saying.
So yeah, next thing I like to add directly to my track is a console EQ, right? So we go EQ, then we go vintage EQ collection, and let's use the console EQ. So again, this is not really part of my mixing process. What I'm trying to achieve at this stage is to emulate the sound of an expensive recording setup. So again, a lot of bigger studios tend to have expensive vocal chains. So your vocal typically going through some sort of preamp. And typically speaking, you'd have a good vocal mic as well, right? So yeah, I'm just trying to mimic the sound of an expensive vocal chain. So I'm doing that by just boosting the air to emulate the sound of a more premium mic, and then I'm going to give it a bit of saturation as well to make it sound like it's going through a preamp. So I'm just going to play it.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
Let's
and
start
to be
some
honest, I
saturation.
prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't trying to say it like it's easy.
Nice and simple, yeah? And yeah, now we can start our mixing process. So quickly before this too.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
So with this too.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
Maybe I'll back off on the air just a little bit, because I'm going to add more air later on in the chain.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in.
Cool, so now we can start our mixing process. So now the rest of the effects I add from this point on will be directly on the bus. So my philosophy with mixing, or I like to sort of think about mixing, I like to address the problems before I start to add decorations. And you can apply this principle to just how you live your normal life. So yeah, let's imagine you're in a messy room, there's trash all over the floor, there's stuff that needs to be swept up. You wouldn't just start spraying air freshener. So yeah, typically you tidy up the mess before you start to add decoration. So yeah, that principle I like to apply to mixing. So I'm always asking myself, what is wrong. So what problems can I hear? I like to address those problems before I then start to add stuff to make the vocal shine. So listen to this vocal. So one of the first problem I like to address is noise, right? So unwanted background noise. If you're recording in, I guess, a proper studio in a vocal booth, you might not have as much of this problem. But me, a lot of times I'm working just right here in my kitchen, or just in a room, or even in a studio with people just in the background that might be talking very quietly, and the mic is going to pick all of these things up. Even sometimes some artists, they like to record quite loud, so you turn them up on their headphones, so you get the headphones bleed into the mic. So I like to tackle the problem of just noise bleeds, right? So yeah, to address the first problem, I'm going to be using a noise gate. So on the vocal bus, we go to dynamics, and then noise gate. And essentially how this works, so we're just focusing mainly on the threshold, is anything below a certain level is basically just going to get removed essentially, right? So to demonstrate, if I start off at 0 decibels, you're going to hear that nothing plays, right? So what I'm going to do as the vocal is playing is I'm going to bring down the threshold just to capture the range of where my vocal actually exists.
Staying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the question. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being
So yeah, this vocal was not too bad with regards to noise. So it was actually well recorded. I think it was just me and him in the room that day. So it wasn't too bad. But yeah, in a lot of tracks, things like in between the gaps, when the artist is not doing anything, that's when the bleeds are very prominent. And when you start to compress the vocals, a lot of times you're raising the noise floor as well. So you kind of want to address that issue. Another way you can tackle this, if you didn't want to use the noise gate, so some people do this as well, they just really go in very surgically and just remove the noises. So every time there's a gap, they just zoom right in and go throughout the whole vocal, and they just basically remove the gaps that way, right? So that's one way to do it. That's probably a bit too time consuming for me, so I prefer to use a noise gate to do this. So that's problem number 1 tackled, sorting out the noise.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context.
So the next issue I want to address are the frequencies that kind of causes the vocal to lose clarity. So I'm going to add an EQ after the noise gate. Now with my EQ, there's 2 main problem areas I'm trying to address. So one of them is sort of like the lower rumble, and another one is kind of the boxy frequency. So when you kind of put your hand over your mouth and talk like that, that's sort of unclear sort of character. So there's a certain frequency band you can tackle to sort of address that. So first of all, I'm going to use a high pass filter. Then I'm going to play the vocal. As the vocal is playing, I'm going to cut out as much of the low frequencies as possible without actually affecting too much of the tone of the vocal, right? So you don't want to overdo it. So high pass on, keep vocal playing.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context.
So if you look at my analyzer, all of this rumble right here,
You're taking everything
we don't need that, right? So we're going to clear that.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest,
About the solid vocal.
you're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely.
So I'm happy with that. You don't want to overdo this. So if I were to go too crazy on this,
You're taking everything I'm saying out.
you kind of lose the body on the vocal, which you don't want to do, right? So I back off just enough that I'm not actually affecting the tone of the vocal, just getting rid of those low rumbles.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant. Before we do this, I'ma need to grab my grinder.
So that's one problem area solved. So the next one, like I said, is the boxy frequency, which is the part where the vocal sort of loses clarity, where it just kind of sounds like it's in a box, right? So to do that, I like to grab one of these bands, and I find it easier to first of all boost it, Then I'm gonna just narrow that just a little bit. Then what I'm gonna do is maybe start off around here, around like 60, 70. Then I'm going to sweep across till I find that one frequency band that sort of irritates me the most, right? That's the closest, that sort of boxy sound. So let's try that. So if I boost this a bit more so I can really hear that frequency.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the question.
So I've gone past it, so it was sort of around here.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
So say for me, it's around 172, but again, every vocal is different, right?
You're taking everything I'm...
So now that I've found it, I'm then going to cut that frequency band. Now, when you're cutting, you don't want to overdo it because that frequency space is still part of the vocal tone. So drastic cuts is just gonna drastically affect the tone of the vocal. So when I'm cutting, probably not more than 4 or 5 decibels, right? So I still retain the natural tone of the vocal. So
you're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that.
And then what I like to do as well, I like to widen the band just for a more natural sound, so it's just not too focused.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest,
So before?
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely.
Over the beat.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the...
At this point, some people will start to find the harsh frequencies and address it at this stage. I like to address that at a later stage. So for now, I'm happy with this first stage of EQ. Next up, I'm going to address the dynamic issue. So if you look at the waveform, you see that there's moments in the vocal that's quieter than others, right? And there's part of the vocals that kind of just jump up at you volume-wise, yeah? So this is what we call dynamics. So of course, it's part of the artist's expression to be louder in certain parts and be quieter in one part. But the issue is this: over the beat is you're gonna get moments where the vocal kind of just spikes up at you, and you're gonna get moments where the vocal kind of gets lost in the instrumental. So this next stage, I kind of like want to level out the dynamics just a little bit more, just to make sure that at every point in the instrumental, the vocal can be heard, right, and it's present. So I'm going to add a compressor, and again, this is on the bus. And we're just using stocks for this. Now we have multiple compressors built in, Logic. So for this one, I'm going to use the Vintage on Opto. First thing I'm going to do is turn off auto gain, so it's not just turning up the volume. And I'm going to turn off auto attack and release as well. So step number 1 is just to find a healthy threshold to work at, right? So I like to maybe start off on 0, then I'll start backing off till I capture the range of the vocal. So you never want to overdo the threshold because then the vocal is going to start to sound very, very squashed. So let's start off here.
You're taking everything I'm saying out.
So as a beginner, you can just watch the needle move. So once the needle starts to move, you're in the range of where the vocal actually exists, right?
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the question. Ain't trying to say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant. Before we...
Cool, so around there, sort of like -2 decibels of reduction, 2 to 3 is what I'm looking for. Ratio wise, I'm gonna go for typically 3:1, 4:1 is what you want to be at for a lead vocal. So let's go around there.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
So yeah, the way a compressor works, it looks at your loudest points in the vocal, it looks at your quieter points, and it's basically just trying to reduce the range between the loudest and the quietest. And the way a compressor does this is not by touching the quietest spot, but by bringing down the louder parts of your vocal. So actually, if you've compressed correctly, what you should end up with is a quieter vocal than what you started with, because this is reducing the peaks, right? So this is before.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely.
So yeah, the vocal is just a little bit quieter, right? But we can use that need to help us to see how much gain we've lost. So the open or the makeup gain is just to boost the volume that you lost during compression. So looking at my chart,
you're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
It looks like I'm losing around -4 decibels of gain. So therefore, I add back around 4 decibels of gain.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
Faster attack.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context.
I like my release to be just a little bit slower than the attack, right? Now, how fast or slow I set the attack depends on, I guess, the pace of the vocal, so the cadence of the vocal. So if it's an artist that's got a faster flow, so more words, then I'll use a faster attack. If there's a bit more sort of like spacing, then maybe a slightly slower attack, right? So
you're taking everything I'm saying out of context.
before.
Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant. Before we do this, I'ma need to grab my grinder and crash some Cali with a little bit of Benson. Can't believe what I've just heard or seen.
Cool, so far so good. We've got noise gate, EQ compressor. Let's see what it sounds like without this three.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant.
So now that I've addressed some of the issues I had, now I can start to sort of decorate a little bit, right? So make the vocals actually shine on top of the beat. So again, I'm going to add a console EQ. I could have done this with the regular EQ, but I just like the tone that the console EQ adds. So yeah, let's first of all add some iMate just to give the vocal a bit more clarity.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy.
Maybe let's target around sort of like the 5K region for this.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question.
Just brings that vocal to life, and let's add a bit more air.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it.
Now you want to be careful with these two knobs, because doing way too much, you're going to introduce a lot of sibilances.
You're taking everything I'm saying,
which you don't want, right? So just a nice LFE amount just to get a clean vocal with more clarity.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant.
Cool, so I like how that's sounding so far. Now, sometimes the decoration can introduce some problems as well. So like you heard, even though I like how bright it sounds, I like the clarity, now we've got some sibilance issues, so where the S's are very, very pronounced. So I'm going to tackle that with a de-esser. A de-esser is basically just a compressor that's just affecting one frequency band. So basically we're just going to target those high frequencies we boosted, just to tame it a little bit so it's not so aggressive. So dynamics, then let's just use the de-esser. Cool, so I like to put this on wide mode, pull the filter on solo, just to have a listen to that frequency area that irritates me the most, basically.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question.
So probably around that 6 to 7K, like is where you want to be targeting. So once I feel like I've found that, the threshold is just the rate at which it starts working at. All right, so if it's all the way on 0, it's not going to do anything.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of.
So we're just going to turn this down until we feel like we're targeting that frequency area. and getting enough reduction.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question.
Yeah, you don't want to overdo this, because when you do, it starts to sound like the artists have like a lisp and can't pronounce their S's. So if I were to go too drastic,
you're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
So you don't want it that drastic, right?
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question.
Before.
Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant. Before we do this, I'ma need to grab my grinder and crash some Cali with a little bit of Benson.
So I'm happy with that. So before.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant. Before.
So yeah, I'm happy with how this vocal is sounding at the moment. One thing I like to do sometimes is I'll add a multi-band compressor at the end of the chain. And essentially what this does is just a compressor, but you're able to target specific frequency areas. So with a multi-band, it splits up the signal into different parts, so 4 different bands. And I can just target each band and compress them individually. So what I like to do, so for my low mids, I like to sort of compress them a little bit just to get a bit more clarity out of the vocal overall. So actually what I'll do is I'll bypass 1, 3 and 4 for now. And I'm just gonna solo 2 and just have a listen to that range, just capture my low mids.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely.
So yeah, that's just that muddy area that can kind of make the vocal lose clarity a little bit. So I'm just gonna set my threshold accordingly.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context.
Also, that's overdoing it, so just a nice healthy amount.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, you're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
If I play in the mix.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant.
And you can see that when I overdo this, we kind of lose presence in the vocal a little bit.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
So I'm going to do a similar thing, but this time I'm targeting those high frequencies just to tame the S's a little bit more. So again, if I just solo band 4.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go.
So I'm just setting the range.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context.
Then I'm just gonna back off on the threshold, right? So as the vocal is playing, as I turn this down, we should hear those S's just get a bit more tamed.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context.
Obviously that's too much.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
Before.
And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant. Before we do this, I'ma need to grab my grinder and crash some Cali with a little bit of Benson. Can't believe what I've just heard or seen. If this was a man, I would've banged him in the spleen. Always rude, but get up, say when I say that you're mean. I tell you that the sea is blue, you tell me that it's green. I tell you that your dress is orange, you tell me.
Cool, so I'm happy with how the vocal is sounding. Next stage is to add my reverb and my delays. Now for my reverb and delays, I like to add this on a separate bus rather than directly on the vocal bus. And you're gonna see why in a minute. So first of all, I'm going to, on the vocal bus, click on send, bus, then just pick one that's not being used. So go bus 2. So it creates that bus directly next to the channel. I'm just gonna rename this reverb. I'm just gonna load up a reverb. Again, we're going stock on this one, so we're just gonna go silver verb. Now, when I'm using the reverb on the bus, I like to keep the wet at 100%, dry at 0%. And now I just need to send some signal to the reverb to hear the reverb. So if I just mute the instrumental for now, so with nothing, then I'm just going to gradually bring up the signal.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
Cool, so one of the reasons why I like to add my reverb and my delays on the bus is that it allows me to treat the reverb and delays as its own entity. So I'll send some signal to the reverb bus. What I can do now is just solo the reverb. So I'm hearing just the reverb, right? So now I can play with this a bit more. So what I like to do is to tighten this up. So I almost always do this. So I like to add an EQ. I can also do this in the reverb as well, but this just gives me a little bit more control. And with this, I like to add like a filter setting. So take out a lot of the low frequencies and take out a lot of the high frequencies. And what this does is it just tightens up the reverb, so it's not too distracting from the lead vocal. So if I just play it without, and let's start cutting out some low frequencies. So see how much rumble is getting cut out and not getting added on top of the lead vocal. And I'm going to do the same the opposite way. So it's not so bright, right? And if I play that with the vocal, and let's do this without first of all.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely, but being disrespectful way out of the question.
Just a much more controlled, tighter reverb sound, right? And when I play that with the beat, it's just gonna be not as distracting.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context.
So yeah, it just sounds a little bit too ambient for this style. So with the EQ after the reverb.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction.
Almost not as noticeable, but it's kind of there, just adding the space that it needs to. So before the reverb.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely, but being disrespectful way out of the question.
Cool, so I'm happy with that. What you might want to experiment with, depending on your track. Play around with different reverb sizes. Like if you have a more sort of like intimate vocal with a lot more gap, then you probably can get away with a bigger size reverb. Cool, so I'm happy with the reverb.
You're taking everything.
Next thing I want to add is some delay, right? So underneath bus 2, so I'm just gonna add another bus. So let's go bus 3 this time. So first of all, let's add a slap delay. So let's rename this slap delay. Then I'm going to add an echo. And typically speaking, I'll leave that on the 8th note. So first thing I want to do actually, also let's send some signal. And same thing that we did with the reverb, we're just going to solo the slap delay for a minute. And I want to turn down the feedback, right? So it doesn't ring out for too long. So if I left this on 64.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context.
And play that with the vocal.
Go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer.
It's very distracting, right? So I want it very tucked in the mix. So first of all, short feedback time, so it doesn't repeat for too long. But also I'm going to turn down the signal as well, so it's just very, very low in the mix.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely, but being disrespectful.
Cool. And again, because it's on the bus, I can now add an EQ after the echo. And I'm going to do a similar thing to what I did with the reverb. So cut out some of those high frequencies, so it's not getting added on top of the dry vocal.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely, but being disrespectful way out of the question.
Do the same with the low frequency.
Ain't trying to say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant.
So it just makes the vocals sound a bit wider, just has a bit more depth to the vocal. Now, lastly, this is going to be my main delay that you actually hear in the mix. So we're going to add another bus. add an echo again. This time around, let's set this to quarter note. And let's send some signal. Right.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go.
Cool, so I like what it's doing, but as you can hear, it sounds quite distracting from the vocal. So first things first, let's tame the feedback.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest,
So yeah, next thing I like to do, I like to sidechain this delay to the lead vocal, right? So essentially what's gonna happen is every time the main vocal is playing, the delay is gonna duck down with volume, so we don't hear it as much, and then it comes back up in volume, only really in the gaps or when the vocal is not as active. So it just makes the delay not be so distracting when the lead vocal is playing. So going back to my delay, after my delay, I'm gonna add a compressor. If I just solo the vocal for a minute. So first of all, on the sidechain mode, I want to set this to the same output my vocal is coming out of. So my vocal is coming out of bus 1. So I'm going to set my sidechain to bus 1. So I mean that my compressor is now listening to bus 1. Turn off my auto gain, turn off auto. So I'm going to start my threshold on 0. Then I'm going to gradually turn it down till I can hear the main vocal interacting with the delay. So again, when the main vocal is playing, I want to hear the delay being ducked down the volume.
you're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the question.
So yeah, it kind of ducks down when the vocal is playing, and then in the gaps, it comes back up. So let's increase the ratio as well. So it's a bit more aggressive with the cuts.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant. Before we do this, I'ma need to grab my grinder and crash some Cali with it.
So how distracting that is in comparison, right? So
Before we do this, I'ma need to grab my grinder and crash some Cali with a little bit of Benson.
cool. A few more things I want to do. So now that we have the delay on the bus, so I've got that flexibility. So I'm just going to solo the bus again, just like we did with the delay and the reverb. I'm just going to add an EQ and just tame some of those low and high frequencies so it's a bit more tucked.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely.
And if I put the lead vocal on top.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck.
So it just gets it out of the way of the vocal. Another thing that I like to do is I like to add actually just a little bit of reverb after that, just to give it a bit of space. So if I just solo the delay so you can hear what that's doing, I'm gonna turn the dry all the way up on this one and then just play around with the wet amount.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you
With the vocal.
But being disrespectful, way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant. Before we do this,
Cool, so I like that. Now, last thing that I like to do with this delay is I like it to sort of pan left to right, right? So it's not just constantly in the middle with the lead vocal, right? And it just makes it sound interesting as well, especially when you're listening with headphones. So after the reverb, I'm going to use a tremolo to do this. So if I go modulation, then I go tremolo, stereo. Then I'm going to play around with the rate, which is just how quick it goes from left to right. So let's go maybe 1 beat.
You're taking everything I'm saying.
Remember, if I bring down the depth, so it's not so drastic. So I like that, yo, the lead vocal.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful, way out of the question.
So let's say that with the beat now.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely.
Maybe bring down the reverb a little bit.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like.
Maybe bring down the instrumental just a little bit as well, so the vocal can breathe more on top.
You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant. Before we
Cool, and I'm pretty much happy with that. So that's pretty much my process in mixing a lead vocal. Hope you found that helpful. I'll leave a link below to this project with just all the effects on it. So yeah, feel free to grab that. So yeah, that's basically how I'll go about mixing a lead vocal in Logic Pro using just stock plugins. So I will do a part 2 using the plugins I'll actually use, so like my Waves, my UAD, etc. I'm gonna pop the link to this project as well in the description, obviously without the beat and the vocals. So yeah, if you wanted to use this as a recording template, yeah, you can definitely do that. But yeah, like, comment, subscribe. Hope you enjoy it, and I'll catch you in the next one.
oh yeah. You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question. Ain't tryna say it like it's easy, but fuck's sake, we're in the middle of a restaurant. Before we do this, I'ma need to grab my grinder and crash some Cali with a little bit of Benson. Can't believe what I've just heard or seen. If this was a man, I would've banged him in the spleen. Always rude, but get upset when I say that you're mean. I tell you that the sea is blue, you tell me that it's green. I tell you that your dress is orange, you tell me it's tangerine. I say October 31st and you tell me it's Halloween. No, you're in the wrong, but agreeing to disagree, you want a pushover. Oh no, that can't run. Cause if you violate, then you know, this thing done. The way I'll ghost on you, you'll think my name is Casper. I won't be looking back, I'm not a chiropractor. I worked your angles out and didn't need protractor. You used to slurp it like it's Indomie or pasta. These days you're colder than the winters in Alaska. You're taking everything I'm saying out of context. Look, if you wanna, you can go in that direction. And to be honest, I prefer if you spoke freely. But being disrespectful way out of the question.